Today, the Democrats withdrew from consideration a resolution calling for the withdrawal of the Marines from Lebanon. Why did they do it?
Well, there's a feeling among members on the committee that there's a lot of confusion in Lebanon and Beirut now. They're not sure what's going on, and they're waiting for a briefing this afternoon by Assistant Secretary of State Eagleberger. They're also afraid that any action they might take might be construed by the Republicans as aiding Syria or undermining the United States' efforts to arrive at a peaceful solution.
Good morning. We're pleased to have Jim Worsham with us from the Chicago Tribune this morning, and as always, we're going to take a look at what's in the nation's newspapers across the country. So as you reach for that other cup of coffee, please have your newspaper in front of the television set with you, and you can begin dialing now. We're going to talk for a few minutes with Mr. Worsham about the Chicago Tribune and what he does on the Hill. But keep in mind that we've got some phone numbers on the bottom of the screen for you to use, 202-628-2525 if you live in the eastern or the central zones, 202-783-2727 if you live in the Pacific or mountain zones. And we haven't been too good lately. We got a lot of people who say they don't read the papers in the morning or don't have them in front of the set. It's very helpful to our exercise here if you can share your experience with us this morning. Jim Worsham is one of two correspondents who works Capitol Hill for the Chicago Tribune. He's been working for that paper for the last 4 years. He's been here in Washington for 3 years. And during the course of his journalistic career, he has covered education, consumer, business, economic, and regulatory issues. He worked for the Boston Globe in Boston for 10 years. He has a Bachelor of Arts from Central Missouri State and the University of Iowa, where he has a master's in journalism. He's married and originally from Louisiana, Missouri. Welcome to C-SPAN.
Thank you.
We have the Chicago Tribune. I'll just give people an idea of what the Chicago Tribune looks like if they're not from that area. This, folks, is yesterday's paper, because what time of day do you get the Chicago Tribune here in Washington?
We
Jim
get a
Worsham?
bundle of them in the early afternoon.
Tell us about a few words about the Chicago Tribune. Where is it politically?
Yeah, I would, the opinion pages are not really my department. I suppose it's moderately conservative. It is not the far-right conservative newspaper that it was under Colonel McCormick years ago.
What is its circulation?
It is daily circulation, I think, is between 750,000 and 800,000, and on Sunday it's almost 1.2 million.
And how big is its bureau here in Washington, D.C.?
We have 12 reporters here.
And how is the mood at the Tribune since the recent events with Rupert Murdoch in Chicago?
Well, we're just waiting to see what he's going to do over there. The Tribune has hired several of the noted people from the Sun-Times. Mike Royko, who is perhaps the most famous journalist in Chicago, has come over. And Lois Willey, who was the editor of their editorial page, has come over to be our associate editorial page editor, and we've hired a number of other editors and reporters.
That's Mike Royko's column. That's on page 3 of yesterday's edition. How long has he been on staff now?
I think it's about a month.
Do you get out there very often?
I haven't been out for about a year.
All right, your beat on Capitol Hill is, or what is it?
Well, there are two of us who cover Capitol Hill, and we do it on sort of a free-form basis. Depends on the issue of the day or the week or various projects we're working on. The two big issues up there now, of course, are the presence of the Marines in Lebanon and the federal deficit.
Did you file a story for today?
I filed a story for this morning's paper on acid rain.
And because we don't have the Chicago Tribune here in Washington, if we've got some viewers who subscribe to that newspaper, please let us know. I think Jim Worsham himself would like to know if it's going to appear. What are the chances that it appears?
Who knows? It depends on how much space they've devoted to Lebanon and how much space they have.
All right, that's a good segue. Let's take a look at some of the morning papers that we get here, as we always do this morning. This is this morning's New York Times, and I think it's a headline that you're going to see a lot of as we go through the morning papers. Lebanon is the main story all across the country, across the papers that we get here. Gemayel foes seize key bases. U.S. gunfire supports regime. Reagan denounces Syria Syrian aid, map, all the rest. Story about the satellite over on the left, reference to the use of bombers, and there's a news analysis article further down. No place to go. The U.S. commitment continues to deepen. Survival of Gamayel appears threatened. Jim Worsham, what is your tack going to be this week? Are you going to try to integrate some Lebanon stories in your Capitol Hill coverage?
We'll be following whatever goes on in the House and Senate on the Lebanon resolution. As you know, there is a resolution in effect now in which Congress gives the administration authorization to keep the Marines there until April 1985. And there is a lot of support in both parties to shorten that, to bring them home. But at the same time, there's a feeling that no one in Congress wants to undermine the administration or encourage the enemy to hold out against the Lebanese or the United States troops.
I want to talk about Stephen Roberts' article this morning in the Washington Talk page of the New York Times on the foreign policy tightrope. And further down here, he has a paragraph that I would like you to comment on. The current increasingly acrimonious debate on Capitol Hill over the Reagan administration's policy in Lebanon has revived a critical set of questions. What is the proper role of Congress in the making of foreign policy? Should politics, quote, stop at the water's edge, unquote? How exactly does Congress make its voice felt? What's your answer to that?
Well, there is quite a dilemma up there as to how far they should go in any kind of resolution in telling the president how to deal with a diplomatic, foreign affairs, military matter. Congress cannot give him tactical and strategic instructions, and even Speaker O'Neill, who has become highly critical of the U.S. role there now, mentioned that the other day. We can't tell him exactly how to deploy troops and what to do this hour or next hour when that happens. They have to set policy and leave the tactical decisions to the administration. The president is the commander-in-chief.
You were at the hearing room yesterday when the proposed, or when the resolution for withdrawal was withdrawn.
Well, the House Democrats on the Foreign Affairs Committee had a closed-door session late in the afternoon. Just before that, they'd been asked by the Republicans on the Foreign Affairs Committee to delay any committee vote on that resolution. And they had about a session of around an hour, and they agreed to do that. Speaker O'Neill said earlier yesterday that there wasn't any chance that they could get that resolution to the House floor before Congress goes on a recess beginning this Friday.
This morning's Washington Post, Beirut under attack, U.S. warns Syria. Militiamen seize much of city, and I think this is a photograph we're going to be seeing more as we go across the country. It showed up in some of the other papers we have here. Two anti-government fighters hold 75mm gun in their hands to fire at a Lebanese army position in West Beirut. Such guns are usually mounted on vehicles. And then another news and analysis story. Crisis tests Lebanon's and U.S. trained army. Let's go to the phones. Phone numbers are on the screen or will be shortly, and we'll be taking your calls in just a second as we talk more with Jim Worsham, who's the Capitol Hill correspondent of the Chicago Tribune. Boston Globe for 10 years. What'd you do there?
Well, for a while I was a copy editor on the copy desk, and then I covered education for 4 years. Boston school busing and higher education. And
were you there during the late unpleasantness?
Oh, I was there during the unpleasantness in the mid-'70s.
Mm-hmm.
The situation has improved a lot.
USA Today, Beirut chaos rocks Gamayel. U.S. reviewing role, says Schultz. 2 satellite losses won't stop the shuttle, and the Fed hits deficits as Dow Jones dives. Paul Volcker, the head of the Federal Reserve Board, will be at a live hearing this morning on C-SPAN. We'll be going to that as soon as we're done here with your calls and comments to Jim Worsham. He'll be testifying on monetary policy, and we'll be joining that hearing in progress. And there's a lot more here to look at. The Washington Times, same approach. Muslim militias seize West Beirut. Washington Times has lately been using a lot of color in its front page, a map of the situation with an inset of President Gemayel. U.S. fleet turns guns on rebels. And let's go to the phones. Arlington, Virginia is first this morning. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
I take it your local paper is the Washington Post or one of the journal papers?
It's the Washington Post, and all 5 columns across the front of it are full of things about Beirut today.
Right.
Incidentally, I think we in the Washington area are very fortunate to have the Washington Post. They're to be congratulated. Their comprehensive reporting on the Beirut situation over the past year and a half has been fantastic.
Have you
Have a
seen?
marvelous group of reporters.
Do you get the Washington Times too?
No, it's that's a little bit too doesn't have enough detail. It's too short. It doesn't go into the detail that I like.
Okay.
The Washington Post will have articles on the front page, and you go to page 823 and so forth and so on. And the background information, and the writers like Jonathan Randall and the people that you've had in your program are really fantastic.
Well, real fan of the Washington Post.
Yeah, well, I'm a real fan of their reporting on this instance. Yes.
What's your observation or question this morning for Jim Worsham?
Well, my point is that the real obstacle to peace in Lebanon is the May 17th withdrawal agreement of Israel. It's not really an honest agreement according to the reporting. As you read from the reports, Israel has set up a mercenary army in southern Lebanon, and it's also bringing Christian phalangists. A recent report a few days ago, they're bringing 1,000 Christian phalangists down to join this mercenary army they have in southern Lebanon. And then, of course, the Christian phalangists have always been allies of Israel. So what we have is an Israel-dominated Lebanon. And so that the offer to withdraw it cannot be taken seriously by the Muslims.
Caller, let me make a point here. Jim, let's be fair to Jim Worsham. He's the Capitol Hill correspondent for the Tribune, and he's one of 2 of them, and he tends to concentrate more on the political and the domestic issues. What do you think about the resolution to withdraw the Marines that was just put on hold for until after the next recess?
Well, I think there's a real political aspect to this whole situation. Mm-hmm. The resolution. As you know, the most powerful lobby in the United States is the American Jewish lobby. In fact, they control the Senate.
Are you making a connection between the
political? In other words, they have to be very cautious because they can antagonize the American Jewish establishment. This doesn't mean that they antagonize American Jews. I'm simply talking about the establishment.
Okay, sir.
It's very pro-Israel policy, and as a consequence, they can actually very much influence the outcome of senatorial, congressional, and even presidential races. For example, the Jewish American establishment vote in California and in New York.
Okay, caller, why don't you hold on? We've got to go to Los Angeles soon. They've been waiting on hold for a while.
But I thought he might want to comment on the political
effect
of our policy.
We need to give him a chance to respond.
All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Your response, Jim Worsham?
Well, I'm not sure what the question was.
To the political influence on Capitol Hill of the American Jewish group lobby?
Well, sure, there always has been a lot of influence.
That's no great revelation.
That's nothing new, and they've affected races throughout the country, as have groups supporting, political groups supporting other candidates.
Los Angeles is waiting, but let's take a look and see if there's also around the country some more comment on Congressman Barbara Conable's retirement. Caught a lot of people by surprise. He's the ranking Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, has a lot to do with the rescue of Social Security last year. See if we hear more about it around the country. Los Angeles, California is next. Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you have your LA Times with you?
No, it hasn't arrived yet. I'm waiting for it to arrive. It should arrive in the next few minutes, but it's not here yet.
Okay. Call us back when it arrives. But in the meantime, what's on your mind?
Well, it seems to me that one of the basic problems over there has to do with the philosophy that the people are following. If Beirut has been leveled 7 times in history, I think that says something about the basic ideas of the philosophy that has little respect for human life. And until they change that, we can do anything we want to, and they'll still be fighting and wanting to kill each other.
What do you think of Congress's response to this situation so far?
Well, I don't think Congress really understands what's going on. There was an article in an underground newspaper here that the whole problem in Lebanon has to do with the hashish trade, and we refuse to even look at that as a possibility. So they have the reasons for fighting that we don't understand, and they just want to shoot each other. They have no respect for human life, and until that changes, I think we're wasting our time.
Well, do you think Congress should have a role in foreign policy then?
Yes, I do. But if Congress is going to close their eyes to what the basic premise of the problems are, I don't think there's going to be anything that's going to be resolved.
Okay, thank you, Los Angeles.
You're welcome.
Does Congress know what's going on over there?
To some extent they do. Yesterday, most senators and representatives were getting most of their information from television and newspapers. And even people like Howard Baker said yesterday morning all he knew at that point was what he was hearing on TV and reading in the newspaper. But he is having a briefing this morning, so he'll know more today.
The Philadelphia Inquirer this morning. Rebel fighting engulfs Beirut, city under fire, army loses ground, and there's a repeat of that photograph we saw earlier this morning already. And then just above the fold, Feldstein foresees $300 billion deficit. Boston, Massachusetts, we're going to hear from next. Good morning, Boston. Do you have the Globe?
Yes. No, I do not have the Globe yet.
Okay. What's on your mind?
I'm a Lebanese, and I just came back from Beirut about 10 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
And yesterday I called Beirut about 6 times.
Did you get through?
Yes, I did.
What'd you find out?
I found out what I've been finding out for the past 10 months. The Lebanese, you see, I'm a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they see it, the main blame they put is on President Amin Ismail for choosing the American option over the Israeli option, because they have been telling him for the past 10 months that this is where you're going to get with the American Congress. In each conflict they've had for the past 30 years, they never let the president come out with a decisive position. It happened in Vietnam, it happened in Korea, and they know that the Congress at one time or another is going to back out. And when Israel was in there, it had the opportunity to rid Lebanon of Muslim forces. It did get rid of the major part of the PLO, but still President Gemayel did not choose the Israeli option. He bowed to the American pressure of not dealing with the Israelis. The Americans on the 17th of May pressured him to come to the agreement with Israel, and then they backed out, and then they said, now go and deal with the Syrians. The main problem in Lebanon now is the May 17th agreement. Lebanon did not want to sign that agreement, and President Gemayel didn't want to sign that agreement, but they pressured him to sign it.
Caller, how do you think Congress is handling this situation?
Well, I listen to CSPAN almost daily,
Mm-hmm.
and I see what congressmen are saying. Many of them don't have an understanding of what's going on over there.
How do you solve that?
Well, you see, the Christians and the Muslims came to an agreement in 1940.
Well, what I mean is, how do you solve the fact that the people who make our laws, in your judgment, don't know what's going on over there?
I can't solve that, but I see that the president has an understanding and the administration has an understanding, but they're not just getting a free hand from the Congress to do what they're supposed to do.
All right. Thanks for the call, Boston. Kind of a press issue. This is in today's New York Times. It's something I want to ask you about as a working journalist. War zone access by press affirmed. Government panel says wide latitude should be given in battlefield coverage. This is by Jonathan Friendly. And the lead says it all. A Pentagon panel drafting guidelines on press access to combat zones agreed today that reporters and photographers should have such access, quote, to the maximum degree possible consistent with the security of the mission and the safety of troops, unquote. Will that satisfy you as a working journalist?
Well, that's kind of hard to answer for me because I've never reported in a combat situation. I think it's different covering the war now, covering any war now, than it was in World War II, because basically then your reporters and photographers just had a pad of paper or a camera, and now you're dealing with television crews that in themselves attract attention. So I suspect military thinking is a little different now than it used to be. Quite frankly, it's hard for me to answer whether that would satisfy me or not, because I'm just not familiar with what it's like over there.
During the public, I'm quoting from the article, during the public session, representatives of 4 news organizations said repeatedly that the press did not want to undermine national security and would not jeopardize the lives of troops for a competitive advantage. Then William Leonard, the former president of CBS News, appearing on behalf of the National Association of Broadcasters, told the group, however, that, quote, the press would be leery of too much doctrine laid down in advance of something we know not, unquote. What's the danger of writing rules too strictly?
Well, the danger of the military writing the rules?
Or any rules?
Well, rules can be misinterpreted or over-enforced or even under-enforced. It's very difficult to write rules for a situation that you really don't know what it's going to be.
All right, back to the phone. San Antonio with Jim Worsham of the Chicago Tribune. San Antonio, go ahead, please.
Good morning. How are you?
Hi, do you have your paper with you?
Yes, I have the Express.
Uh-huh. And what's on the front page?
It says here that, well, the top part has to do with the South Texas nuclear project plant.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has the Gamayel is near fallen.
Is that a wire service story?
It's come from the Los Angeles Times, Associated Press.
Okay.
And New York Times.
Is there anything, now we've got the Lebanon story there, we've got a local story. Is there anything about the budget, Feldstein, Stockman, anything like that?
No, not on the front page.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I look over here real quick, go here to the second page, I don't see nothing. And I don't see nothing on the third page. So.
All right. Well, I want to give you a gold star this morning. We had only one other caller who was here across the river in Arlington who had the Washington Post in front of him. And glad to see you're playing the game with us.
Thank you.
What's on your mind this morning?
Well, I just want to say that we have one very, very serious problem with the foreign policy that comes from our country all over the world. I don't care what country you go to, you're going to have the left side and you're going to have the right side in the politics. And so in this country, even though we elect a president, he appoints a cabinet, and he's got a secretary of state and all of that, speaking on the one side, we got the left side over here run by Mr. Tip O'Neill and the Democrats and the liberals in the House. And that's a very powerful force. So you got all these people on these countries, they got people over there in Washington, and they just feel the pulse of Mr. O'Neill and all of that. And then they react according to what comes from, like Mr. O'Neill made a mistake a few days ago. He interfered, for some are concerned, in the State Department job with the policy. He made a statement that we're going to have to get the Marines out. Well, that was a signal right away to the left side over there in Beirut and Lebanon. Say, hey, Mr. O'Neill, it's already chicken out over there. You know, let's start pushing a little harder.
Okay, thank
you. Put a little more pressure, maybe somebody get hurt, another Marine get killed, and then you got more Democrats saying, hey, we better get the Marines out. So, Mr. Worsham, don't you think that maybe we got too many congressmen over here trying to make it the policy of the country instead of the president and his department, foreign policy? Thank you very much.
Well, Congress is supposed to help the president make foreign policy. And I think Speaker O'Neill was expressing his own opinion that we ought to get the boys out as soon as possible. Now, the Speaker is not coming out for a precipitous withdrawal. I mean, he is not saying we should bring them out tomorrow, because that could endanger the Marines themselves and other members of the peacekeeping force. But there's a lot of sentiment in Congress that feels that the Marines should be brought out one way or another. Different members of Congress have different views on how it ought to be done.
This is today's Philadelphia Inquirer. Media coverage is moving Hart to center stage, and I want to ask you about this as a journalist, Jim Worsham, because down here it talks about the transformation of the Gary Hart campaign, and it talks about dynamics. Exactly how this transformation, which could disintegrate in a moment should Hart fail to finish in at least a strong third in the New Hampshire primary February 28th, came about, says as much about the dynamics of presidential politics and the journalists who cover them as about the Hart campaign itself. What do you think that means?
Well, I think I haven't read the article. I would like to. It says a lot about how Hart might be playing to the media, or how the media is perceiving Hart. Hart is, we've had a lot of stories in the last few weeks on John Glenn's campaign being in disarray, and with that, a lot of members of the press corps look at the other candidates and sort of wonder which one of those could break through.
As a journalist, how do you feel about the phrase PAC journalism?
Well, I don't like PAC journalism, and it, to some extent, is quite apt when you're one of 50, 60, 70 people standing in a hallway staking out a closed-door meeting, or if you're on a presidential trip somewhere with 100 other reporters and photographers and technicians, you feel like you're one of the PAC. And day by day, the number of reporters in New Hampshire is growing, so it'll be quite a PAC by the end of the month.
By the way, that article we quoted from was by Larry Eichel, the Inquirer Washington bureau staffer. Gardenia, California is next this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you happen to have your paper with you?
Yes, I have the Los Angeles Times.
Excellent. What's it say across the top of the page?
Top of the page, interest rates remain high.
Mm-hmm. Is that on the left?
Well, on the left, it's about the Olympic Games, and over on the right side, they got Fed to limit suppliers of new money. And they got a story about Beirut.
What's the headline read?
Above the Beirut story?
Yeah.
It says West Beirut sized by military men.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
They have the stock market suffers worst decline of the year. And Reagan backs Jamal is another article.
Okay. Is there anything about Feldstein?
Yes, they have on the editorial page, which is by, it's not by an individual, it's just kind of an editorial comment, and it says a house divided, and it talks about the difference between Secretary Treasurer Reagan and Feldstein, their differences about the budget situation.
Okay. What's your comment or question for Jim Worsham this morning?
My question is why there's not more publicity given to the fact that the administration tried to project the image of being of saving money when the administration want to give $8 billion to the international bankers.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Caller, are you still on the line?
Yes.
You want to repeat your question, please?
Well, my question is why there's not more publicity about, from the reporter's standpoint, I mean, about the fact that the Reagan administration pretend to be saving money, and one area they want to give $8 billion to the international bankers. You know, that's been going on for a couple of months or so.
Are you talking about refunding the International Monetary Fund?
Yes, with $8 billion.
Okay.
Well, on the one hand, the administration does want to cut back on a lot of programs, but there are some programs they want to expand. And this is apparently one area. I'm not completely familiar with that, but the Reagan administration is not cutting everywhere. they're building up defense, and they're adding to that program too.
But the caller seems to think that that isn't getting as much publicity as it deserves. What do you think?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the issue, but I suspect it depends on what paper you're reading and how they judge a story of that kind.
By the way, we're still waiting to hear from somebody in the Chicago area who might have a copy of this morning's Chicago Tribune for a couple reasons. One, Jim Worsham would like to see if his story that he filed the other day is going to actually appear. And I guess you won't know what the headline will be, will you?
No, we don't write the headlines.
Mm-hmm. And what was the article about?
It had to deal with the 8 candidates for the Democratic nomination for president uniting and calling on Congress to pass some sort of acid rain control program.
Okay, Chicago Tribune readers, we want to hear from you. Southfield, Michigan, good morning.
Yes, sir. I have the Detroit News in front of me.
Boy, we're doing good this morning. What's it say on the front page?
Well, this is the Monday news. Lebanon Premier Cabinet resigned in bid to ease crisis. Israel may pull out of Lebanon. And the inside page, there's an article, Vice President Bush backs up Palestine and bid for bipartisan support with Democrats on economics.
Is that a story about his appearance on the Sunday morning talk shows?
I didn't read the entire article.
Mm-hmm.
I was just glancing through the paper.
Okay.
But the part I wanted to really mention was about Israel pulling out of Lebanon. I think what is happening there, and I heard the previous caller, mention the fact that Israel, its lobby is pressuring the United States for support in that area. I think the United States has been effective with the Marines, although the danger to the Marines is very apparent. But I think they have been effective in that there has been some compromises made in the Middle East. Otherwise, Israel would have never bidded to make that statement of pulling out of there. However, I think Israel will and still need American support militarily, and the pressure to keep the pressure of the Soviet Union off the United States, also off of Israel. And I think so many callers don't include the threat of Soviet expansionism.
Caller, Jim Worsham covers Congress with pretty much an emphasis on domestic issues. He's pretty familiar with the way Congress operates.
Well,
do you have any observations to make about Congress and foreign policy?
Yeah. As far as Congress's foreign policy, I think they're putting too much pressure, although some pressure probably will be apparent in the Democrats' election year. However, the United States still, even though they negotiate with the Soviets, they would still have to negotiate with strength and not from fear. Because if the Soviets ever get the idea that the United States is negotiating out of fear, the consequences could be probably in opposition to what the United States is trying to seek.
Okay, thank you. Jim Worsham. Any comment?
Not really.
We're going to take a minute or two to show you some papers that you're going to be seeing a lot more of on C-SPAN. This is a copy of the Des Moines Register that we got through the mail. That's why they call this the back date, covers up the banner. But all next week, we're going to be located in Des Moines, and we'll be featuring on the call-in program editors and writers from the Des Moines Register. And while we're at it, let's take a look at the cartoon on the front page. This is from Wednesday of last week. John Glenn speaking before a group of 2 cleanup people. And the caption reads, "Do you mind turning off the lights when you're done, Mr. Glenn?" And if you can get closer, you can read the text of his speech that says, "This race has just begun." And we're talking to Jim Worsham of the Chicago Tribune, who's a Capitol Hill correspondent there. Next call for him is from Los Angeles, California. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
We're doing just fine here.
Okay.
Do you have your paper in front of you?
Yes, the paper is the New York Times. We don't get the Los Angeles.
Oh, today's edition of the Times?
Yeah, we find the LA Times a little sensational for our taste.
Okay. Let's see if your edition has the same lead stories as ours. What's it say on the front page?
It has the 3-column headline of the Jamal Foes base.
Yeah.
And the Federal Reserve on one side and the second satellite lost.
Okay, pretty much the same thing.
The same as yours, isn't it?
Yeah. That's delivered by satellite, I think.
Yes.
What's on your mind this morning?
Well, about the story you mentioned about the war zone access by the press, and the Pentagon panel seems to have said that was the right thing.
Right.
Well, in principle, I suppose I agree to that as well. However, I think what the American public is saying in siding with the present administration is that while Walter Cronkite and a lot of important press people say that we need impartial observers, I think what our country is saying is that the press has become not partial, very partial observers, not impartial observers at all. That you are very partial in the way you present the news, and some of it is not responsible journalism. Some of the answers I find really very disturbing. The press is always saying that, well, we make mistakes and in crises and under pressure we make mistakes, but they still feed us or serve us the news and demand that we take it the way they feed it to us. There's such an arrogance there.
Caller, hold on. Let's have Jim Worsham respond to what you've said so far. Is she hitting you where you live?
Well, we hear this an awful lot. A lot of times it's the people don't like the news, so they say that we're doing something wrong to it or distorting it or packaging it in a biased way. But you can read a newspaper, you can watch television, you can listen to radio and get different accounts of the same story. There are just different ways of covering it. I know most of the people I know try to cover it as fairly and as accurately and as thoroughly as possible. But obviously all reporters are people, and every person...
I wonder if I could respond to that.
Sure.
A perfect example of this, I mean, that's a very typical press answer, but a perfect example was after the Grenada thing and the press exclusion, there was such a lot of self-examination by the media and outrage expressed and panels and conferences that just go on. And the media, of course, examines itself and then exonerates itself. And one of the examples that I'd like to give is, I can't count now how many journalists, people who had been editors, etc., saying, we must have impartial observers, because look at the terrible mistakes the American government made in reporting Grenada. They told us only 1,100 Cubans were there, and Cuba told us 700, and Cuba was right. Now there's a perfect example. The willingness to take Cuba's figures rather than our government's figures.
Okay, thank you, Los Angeles.
Well, sometimes you get figures from the United States government about something that don't necessarily coincide with what your own investigation has turned up.
Still waiting to hear from Chicago. In the meantime, Orlando, Florida is with us. Go ahead.
Good morning. How are you?
We're doing fine here. Do you have your paper with you?
I do. The Orlando Sentinel has a two-column head on the right side. Worsham cabinet resigns in Lebanon. Actually, the most prominent headline on today's paper has to do with the runaway satellite. I've got a question for you and a question for Mr. Worsham.
No, shoot.
Number one, really what is the premise of this program? In a general way, not just this morning's premise.
Okay.
And Mr. Worsham, I'm going to pose these questions and hang up and listen.
Okay, but I want to ask you another before we leave.
Sure.
Okay.
The second question is to Mr. Worsham, and that is, in his understanding of the relationship between the executive and legislative branch of the government, is it really possible for Congress to set foreign policy of the United States government? Because I believe in the long run that's really why the United States is getting into trouble all around the country, all around the world, excuse me, and more importantly, what prevents democracy and capitalism from being a more popular form of government. We seem to falter, to not be able to pursue as an effective, aggressive foreign policy as totalitarian governments. So really, when you analyze where democracy and capitalism is in the world, it comes down to how we govern ourselves and how we relate as a government to the world in which we live. If there's something intrinsically wrong with the way our foreign policy is administered, perhaps it's because we just haven't invented a better way for the executive and legislative branches of government to deal with foreign policy.
Okay, caller, before you go, have you seen this program very often?
I've seen it twice.
Twice. Okay. Anything else?
Not a thing. I'd like to listen to you discuss these two points, unless you want me to hang on and cross-examine.
I think not. We're going to have another call on the line very soon, and we don't want to keep them waiting as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jim Worsham, why don't you go first?
All right. Well, foreign policy is an area that's a little fuzzy when you look at the executive branch and the legislative branch. Congress has the authority to declare war and to appropriate funds to carry it out. The President is the Commander-in-Chief and the Chief Diplomatic Officer of the government. 20 or 30 years ago, foreign policy was basically bipartisan, but with the Vietnam War and the 1970s, a lot of members of Congress felt that they should raise objections when the President does something in foreign policy they don't agree with. Of course, it is a fuzzy area, who has what powers, how far should Congress go, and restricting the President. That's not written in the Constitution or necessarily in any law. So they have to kind of gauge for themselves. A totalitarian regime, of course, can conduct a more efficient, probably more effective foreign policy, but I think it's been said 1,000 times, democracy can be inefficient and slow, but if you want one of the others, you can take that too.
And as to the caller's first question, sometimes we forget that new people are tuning in all the time. It gets to be kind of a small breakfast group discussion sometimes, but it's getting bigger all the time, and it's good to explain, and a good thing he asked the question so you get a chance to describe the premise of the program, which is something that Jim Worsham and I were talking about before the program, and that is that the press is increasingly practically another branch of the government, the fourth branch of the government. They have a lot to say about how Americans make their decisions because the press provides the information that we all get upon which we base those decisions. And this is one program where viewers can talk back to the men and women who write the news that you read every morning or every afternoon in your daily newspaper, and a chance for the journalists to hear what people think about the job they're doing. And so far over the last year that we've been doing this, we've discovered a few things about how major stories are played across the country and how they vary subtly from time to time, many times, and I think if this is the second time that the caller from Orlando has seen the program, he wouldn't be surprised that a lot of the stories seem to be the same. But every now and then, there is an interesting difference that our guest journalists can offer some insight into and tell us some of also the mechanics of how they report the news. Anything more, Jim Worsham, on that before we go to Irving, Texas?
No, let's go to Texas.
Okay, Irving, Texas, good morning.
Good morning.
Do you have your paper, sir?
First off, I'd like to say you run an excellent program.
Well, thank you.
I've watched for about a year now, and this is the first time I've been able to get through, but it's been a real interesting program.
What do you find most valuable about this program? Is it being able to ask a question of the journalists or the look at the nation's headlines?
Well, the questions to the journalists generally provide the most interesting comment from the American public.
Mm-hmm.
Really great that y'all are able to go from coast to coast, north, south, east, and west, and get varying opinions from all walks of life.
Okay.
The question that I had for Mr. Worsham was the situation of the Iranian hostage crisis that I believe ultimately brought down Jimmy Carter when President Reagan was elected. The civil war is just erupting in Lebanon now. I mean, the most conservative person would have to say it's falling apart. And the Italian, French, British, and American troops are soon to be in a situation where they're going to have to fight for their lives just to be able to get out in one piece. Could you see that situation prolonging itself until the election, or do you think Congress would take steps to to rectify the situation and get the Marines out before a total chaos situation erupts?
Well, it's awfully hard to say what's going to happen with our Marines and our allies' forces over there between now and the election. It's awfully hard to say what's going to happen between now and this weekend. The situation is so fluid over there that the next 48 hours could bring something totally new. The current authorization for troops runs until April 1985, but it is possible that the administration may want to find a way to get the Marines out of Lebanon, because once our Marines are out, then it's much less a sensitive issue domestically and politically.
Jim Worsham, there's a story that we've seen in a couple other papers around the country, but the one we just saw was from the Washington page of the USA Today. Congress's air trip extras to be paid by taxpayers, and they come up with some large charges that taxpayers made apparently to the Paris Air Show. And then again in this column there is a reference to New York Congressman Representative Barbara Conable retiring after 20 years. Do you know Barbara Conable?
No, I don't.
What's his reputation on the Hill?
Well, he's ranking, the top-ranking Republican on the Appropriations Committee, or excuse me, Ways and Means Committee, which is the House committee that writes tax bills. He's known as a very effective legislator and is respected by members of both parties.
All right, San Diego, California. Good morning. San Diego.
Yes.
Do you have your paper with you, ma'am?
Not this morning. It's a little early. I can't work both you and the paper in at the same time.
Okay, well, that's the best excuse we've heard all year, by the way, for not having the paper.
Okay.
What's on your mind this morning?
Well, I have my Constitution here,
Mm-hmm.
and from what I just heard, it sounds just a little bit like me that they are trying to make some kind of regulations prohibiting the free exercise of the freedom of speech. I mean, the press. And I don't like it.
You referring to the Pentagon panel that we were talking about earlier in the program?
Yes, where they were setting up some regulations.
So you have some fear that these regulations are an infringement on the right of free speech and freedom of the press?
I certainly do.
Uh-huh. How do you think others feel about that? I mean, there's...
I have this growing fear that there's a tendency toward not wanting to know, and it frightens me. And another thing that frightens me is the figures that we get every time there's something happens in Lebanon. We hear about a minimal body count or something like that, and to me, no body count is minimal. All those people have relatives, and I don't mind watching their relatives cry. I want to know that somebody cares about those fellows.
How do you feel about the press criticism of the Reagan administration's restrictions on their access to the Grenada invasion?
I feel that they have every right to be really upset about it, because I want to know about those things. I want to know what my government's doing.
Okay, anything else?
Well, I think that just about covers it. I could think of a lot of things.
All right, well, we'll use that one for this morning. Jim Worsham, some strong feelings on the other side.
Well, I agree that any kind of restriction on the press is something that the press and the public ought to be interested in and want to know more about. I think I certainly have always come down on the side of more information rather than less. And whenever you have restrictions, even in a war zone, and I'm not familiar with the mechanics of restrictions in war zones, I think it's something to be concerned about.
This just might be the call that we've been waiting for. This is from Chicago, Illinois, and I hope Chicago has the Tribune.
I do too.
Chicago?
Yes, I do.
You do?
Right.
What's on the front page?
Okay. Headlines are Syria-backed rebels overrun West Beirut.
Okay.
That's the major one. Then you have second satellite aloft, spacewalk still on.
What picture do you have above the fold on page 1?
Center, it's a picture of President Reagan with his cake.
Oh, in Dixon, Illinois.
Right.
That's kind of almost a local story, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
That's 100 miles, I think, west of the city?
Approximately.
Yeah. Now, here's the $64 question. And have you looked to see if there's a story by Jim Worsham
Yes, I have, and it's on page 3.
What's the headline?
Okay. 8 candidates urge action on acid rain.
Hold the phone. How do you like that headline?
That's all right. That's fine.
Who do you think wrote it? Do you know the person who might have written it?
Headlines are written by copy editors. I used to be one, and that's as it should be.
Did you ever get criticized by a reporter for the headline you wrote as a copy editor?
Well, usually not the reporter. The criticism was filtered through various layers of editors, but we've heard criticism.
Okay. Chicago, what's on your mind?
I would like to compliment you fellas. I think this is the first time I have gotten you. We're just new with cable now, and I think this program is fantastic. And the one caller earlier who was complaining a little bit about the fact that we took the Cuban figures during Grenada as opposed to our government figures. To that I say right on. Because of this fact, it's not that I feel I'm an American, it's the fact that what is accurate and correct is what should be reported. And if that is what is proven is accurate and correct, that's what we stand for.
Okay.
We should report.
Anything else?
No.
Well, thanks for coming through for us.
Keep it up.
Thank you. Goodbye. Jim Worsham, anything else on Grenada you want to say?
Not really. That is not my area, so I'll stay out of it.
There's another newspaper that we don't often have here that we want to refer to, and that is the Manchester Union Leader. And the reason we hold this one up this morning is because, and this is not anywhere near a current newspapers from last week, is because when C-SPAN is in New Hampshire covering the New Hampshire primaries, we'll be operating in part out of the offices of the Manchester Union Leader to show you a day in the life of the Union Leader, much as we have with other newspapers around the Washington metropolitan area. And to point out, too, an interesting aspect of this particular newspaper that I don't think is very common around the country, and that is the front page editorial. Here is the editorial on the front page from February the 3rd, tough questions for Mr. Mondale, and it was asking him tough questions about, let's see, this newspaper thinks it is encouraging to know that there are sensible young Democrats such as Mr. Singos who have not lost sight of their responsibility to ask the tough questions about the man presumed to be the party's leading contender, and it had to do with a letter to the editor that appeared in the same paper, and a similar front page editorial from another edition of the Union Leader on the day after the president announced his candidacy for re-election. A one-word editorial. Reagan runs again. Wow. And it's a signed editorial by the president and publisher of the Union Leader, Naki Loeb. Gardenia, California is next this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, do you have your paper with you?
Yes, LA Times.
Ah, okay.
Above the fold is West Beirut seized by militia gunmen.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something interesting because just below that is House Democrats put off bid for Marine withdrawal.
What do you think of that?
Well, what I think, and it's pretty upsetting, when you think about this, we're one of the biggest power in the world. And when you talk about militia gunmen, you think that, and I want Jim to comment on this, we can't handle a bunch of what I consider bandits, and all being the person that are pro-illegal, but I mean, we could just stamp them out in a minute and get out of Beirut and settle up for, get the thing over once for all. Why have all this big armament that we have, and we can't handle a simple little thing like that because of politics?
Okay, caller. Jim Worsham is more of a reporter of the Congress than military affairs. How about if we ask you what your reaction is to Congress considering a resolution that would ask for immediate withdrawal?
Well, see, in Washington, I got nothing against Reagan first.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we need a man's man in Washington. You know, I mean, this business appealing to old women and young kids. You know, that doesn't help our country a bit to be a movie star and what they call a #1 communicator. Now, we need a man up there like Goldwater. We passed up a beautiful chance to elect him president, and we wouldn't be having this junk that we're having now.
Okay, thank you very much. Jim Worsham, comment?
It sounds like this gentleman wants a much stronger use of American military force, and as much as I don't know about the military force, I think there's a reluctance to use it for fear of escalating military conflict in the Middle East.
We're very pleased to welcome a new affiliate to the network this morning, Centel Cable TV in Humboldt, Iowa. You can watch C-SPAN there on Channel 3, and the system manager is Merritt Torgerson, and that'll be nice to have new viewers out there. This afternoon at 5 o'clock East Coast time, assuming that the House is not in session, Congressman Ron Packard, a Republican of California, will be our guest. And then later on tonight, Congressman William Ratchford, a Democrat of Connecticut. We're continuing on as we wait for going to the hearing with Paul Volcker this morning. We'll take a call from Orlando, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. This is
Orlando?
Yes.
Okay.
This is Jim Huffman talking.
Great to hear from you.
Well, it's nice to hear from you. I've been listening to you for a year and a half, your programs, and I think it's excellent.
Thank you.
And I would like to ask you or your guest if my impression is wrong in regard to the budget and to the defense budget.
All right, we'll let you address your question to Mr. Worsham.
Yeah, it's my impression that the President, the Congress, Senate, and House, as well as the press, seem to make a big issue of the deficit. And my impression, they're like a fireman going to a fire, that when they get there, all they do is try to contain the smoke and just let the fire go. Like they make a big fuss about the word deficit and never do anything concrete about it. And I was wondering if it's too simple just to suggest that they consider a revenue collection system like we had before the Reagan giveaway of $650 billion in 1981 to balance the budget. Nobody seems to be thinking of that one angle.
Okay, thank you, sir. Jim Worsham?
Well, certainly raising taxes would bring in revenues, and that would reduce the deficit, but the Reagan administration is pretty dead set against any general tax increase, and they're pretty dead set against reducing defense spending. Now, this leaves domestic spending, and Congress is pretty dead set against that. So some sort of compromise has to be worked out. Whether it will or not this year remains to be seen, as they say.
From where you sit, do you think Congress is going to accomplish very much this year?
That's a good question. There's a possibility that they'll put together some package of spending cuts and some very small tax measures and some cuts in defense. Both Republicans and Democrats have let it be known they want to cut the defense budget. But I wouldn't look for anything big.
Before we go, another look at yesterday's edition of the Chicago Tribune. Jim Worsham is the Capitol Hill correspondent for them, and recently acquired new columnist, Mike Royko. And it's a newspaper that we'll try to have here more often. We'll have to get your fellow correspondent in your bureau over here. Think he'd come over and do the show?
Well, she might. I'll talk to her.
We've just about run out of time with Jim Worsham. I want to thank him for participating with us. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
And thank you for your calls. Thank you for watching. Always makes the system work, and especially to the caller from Chicago who told us what first of all, that Jim Worsham's article appeared this morning and what the headline was. He seemed satisfied with that. Have a good day. Thanks for watching. Now in progress, over in the House Banking, Finance, and Urban Affairs Committee, Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, is testifying. Let's join him.